So my name's Leanne. I've been in long-term recovery for 16 years. The beginning of my story and end of my story we're going to kind of go through in some slides, but just as that introduction, I grew up in Crookston somewhat. My parents were migrant workers, so they would come back and forth during the summers. And that's kind of how we ended up here when my parents decided to get divorced. Because the fact that Minnesota had more access to services for families was a huge reason why my mom stayed. She's never had a job outside of the home. She raised 10 kids. And so when my dad decided to take off, this was the best place for us. And that I have found to be very true. Like, the services offered are great, is how do we utilize them, right? I ended up struggling with addiction and went through a whole host of stuff. So kind of what we'll talk about is just basic childhood stuff. What happens, right, in families like mine? Where do I feel personally it went wrong? And who was I? Like, what type of families? And then we'll just talk about where things, went left for me and what kind of supports I think that would have been helpful for me at that time in my life that I didn't have, that we have now, that we have available. And then just my short process through addiction in prison, and then kind of what I've been doing since then. So this is just like a glimpse. I'm the little one right in the middle down there with the bowl cut. It looks, like, oh, my nice little happy family. The one in the dress there, I was probably 9 or 10. Right? It looks like, look, my mom fixes my hair, dresses me up. Life can't be that bad, right? Those are my teenage years where I started to go south and was hanging out with people who were, more into the outcast world, right? They didn't come from good places. They weren't doing good things. They weren't making good decisions. But the reality was, neither was my home. These two pictures are a complete lie. My father was a heroin addict and my mom was very codependent, and there was a lot of abuse in our house. There was a sexual abuse in our house. There was drug addiction. I've seen my father shoot up, drugs. There was so much going behind the scenes and nobody ever knew. We never had CPS available. We never had any services. We never, honestly, Mexican families, it's hit a lot, and it's normalized. But that's, for me, where I found my escape from those things, because I didn't have, was taught, don't tell, don't ask for help, don't speak out. So I wasn't going to go to school. I wasn't going to go to a counselor. I wasn't going to go to somebody and say, this is what's going on at home. So what happened? I started doing what I knew to do. I had a baby, my first baby, a month before my 15th birthday, while all this trauma was happening. And she got taken from me 6 months later by her father. And at that time in my life, as a 16-year-old coming from trauma, already feeling hurt, feeling abandoned, having no coping skills, feeling unloved, I pretty much gave up on life. And that's where my addiction started. So we can go on to the next one here. So these are a couple articles that were written here locally and in the Grand Forks paper when I did get charged. And that was like at my worst in prison. I was unhappy, I was overweight, my mental health was bad. But one thing that I kept these. I kept these for a reason. And if you look at the last paragraph on this first one, we all know our local person here, but it says, Bueller went on to say, Aguirre was my old married name. Aguirre scored 45 out of possible 54 on the criminal history report, one of the highest scores I have ever seen, and that pre-sentence investigation report showed she's a very high risk of reoffending. I kept these when I was in prison, and I would read them over and over and over and over because of the way that I saw that people saw me. And excuse me if I get emotional. That wasn't me. And the fact that I could never get to a place where I felt comfortable or vulnerable enough, because I was mean and I was angry and I was closed off, and what you got was going to be nothing but rebellion and resistance. Nobody could work with me. Why? Because the way they worked with me was from that perspective. It was from that perspective. And any time that I initiated any sort of service, whether it was in prison or elsewhere, it was constantly, why are you doing this wrong? What's the problem? Why can't you just get it? Figure it out. It's not that hard. That's not what I needed. That isn't what I needed to hear. I needed somebody to understand who I was, because I didn't even know that, but I just knew that that wasn't me. And that first person came while I was in prison. I did the early release program for boot camp, CIP. I got a 12-year sentence. I ended up doing 5 years and 9 days before I was accepted to CIP. I went to CIP and I met the most amazing counselor. We can go to the next one here. And I also started running while I was in that program. But this counselor had a way of very much balancing boundaries and self-respect for herself, so she would not allow me to be the way that I had been with a lot of people, right? If I'm going to cuss at you, yell at you, if I'm going to be hard on you, a lot of times that was my way of pushing people away. Then they would go away because they're like, I'm just not going to help you. You don't want it. But her, on the other hand, I mean, she was 4'11", I mean, but she was just such a badass. She had a way of enforcing boundaries while making me feel loved. She had a way of enforcing boundaries and respect for herself while holding respect for me. She had a way of being able to tell me, knock it off, Leanne. I'm here because I care. You know, she had a way of connecting with me that saw who I was, didn't allow certain things, but yet really wanted to know me and help me. And she was the first person I had ever met that I felt very comfortable enough. You know, she would tell me, what are your dreams? What do you want to do? I'd never had dreams. Honestly, they think about kids like, I wanted to be a lawyer. At one time, I remember that when I was like 8. Other than that, I can't remember the last time I'd even thought about a future. Like, when she asked me that, I'm like, I have no idea. And the first thing she said was, well, I see you like to run. You know, I would always go out in the morning and run PT. I started running when I was there. I said, I do. She goes, what do you think about ever running a marathon? I was like, how far is a marathon? And she's like, 26 miles. I'm like, you got me effed up, girl. It's like, there's no way, you know? But she was like, why? Why do you limit what you think you could do? And she would ask me questions like this. I'd never been asked questions like this. I'd never been sat with and looked at as a person who had possibilities to even dream. Everything was just always focused on what I was doing wrong. And nothing that I was doing well, ever. So, you know, I started running, and after 5 years and 9 days, I was released home. And I came home in 2010. In 2010, when I left prison, I continued to run. I was on parole until 2017. I spent 7 years on parole at the state of Minnesota. But in that time, I really used running as part of my coping skills. It was just one of the big foundations for me because it showed me what I could do. So I set that goal to run a marathon while I was in prison. I said, I want to run it within 1 year. It was actually 1 year and like 12 days, the first marathon I ever did. And I started to see what I was capable of. I started to recognize the things inside of me that had been part of my destructive life. They were always there, the traits, the personality traits, the behaviors, the beliefs. You know, anything I want, I'm going to do. You can't tell me anything. Like all of these stubborn mentalities that had really forced me into the direction I was going were actually the basis for being able to move along. And I did a lot, you know, with running. I have been part of Mile in My Shoes. I've been part of Team Kaizen. I've been part of running Runners for Against Destructive Decisions, multiple agencies as a coach, either a mentor, participant in some way. So running has just been a big, huge part of my life. But then, you know, I also went to college. That building of my confidence, and not only did I just go to college, but I realized I was really smart. Too. So, I mean, I graduated cum laude, double honors. I was, you know, Alpha Phi, like Dean's List every year. Like, I won Paper of the Year award for my senior research project at the Student Academic Conference. Like, I had a 9th grade education before I got my GED in prison. And nobody helped me. Nobody taught me. I can't remember a time in my life that somebody sat with me and said, this is where you put an apostrophe, Leanne. So to write a 30-page paper, to, be honored for that, and had really no help but the Resource Center and, myself, my learning, again, all went back to those things that always been there, but people never focused on. People never said, I think you could use that to do this. But coming home, I learned that anytime my brain would start getting to me in life, this happens with anybody in recovery. It's miserable, I don't want to do this, oh, life is that. I learned to use a lot of the CBT myself to alter that mind and that framework and tell myself, like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to go back to prison, and then what? Start all over? And, that mentality really helped me to propel myself forward. And education became a big part of my life. And not only that, it led to a lot of what I do now, right? So if we look, the top one, I worked with the Human Service. I worked with many different services on trying to change our Felony Voting Act, which now has, years later, finally happened. Because for me, I was multiple felony. I have 7 felonies on my record. But within my first year home, I was married, owned a home, was paying taxes, and running a business. But you're going to tell me I have no say-so in anything that impacts my life. That's another thing that I felt just kept people down. I can be as successful as I want to be and do all the things that make me a good citizen and a good friend and a good mom and a good community member, but I don't have any say-so in those things. That was horrible. So that was, one big initiative. The middle picture was taken the first time that I came to the Crookston jail from the last time that I left it. But I was there in a completely different capacity. By this point, I had opened up my own treatment center. I had become an independent counselor. I was doing Rule 25 assessments up at the jail. So I'd be contracted to come down and do chemical health assessments. And I took that picture the very first time that I went there, because for me, I never forget where I come from. That's one thing, I live that story so much in front of me. And walking in there was so emotional. And it was even double emotional because I ended up running into the police officer, Rascott, who became the resource officer, is who raided my house and arrested me the day that I got all these charges. And when I walked in to go and sign in to see my client, he was at the front. And he didn't remember me, but I introduced myself, and I had seen him a few years back. But to be able to have those interactions for myself was and I tell this to my clients, it doesn't matter where you come from, it matters where you go. It matters what you do next. If you would have looked at that first article that was said about me, do you think that I'd be walking into the courthouse in the jail in the position that I was in, doing what I was doing? No, nobody would have thought that about me. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't have, this town is what this town is. So my family wasn't looked upon greatly. It was talked about for a long time. So for me, it is constantly, honor and love and this self-fulfilling thing that I always knew. People didn't know me. I know me. I know who I am. But I just had to find a way to tap into that and find resources and people to help me actually get there. So I've done training for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. One of my kind of quirks is I love law. I love statutes. So I'm a clinical supervisor now. I left private practice during COVID to assist my husband with running our businesses because they're service related, and obviously we were decimated during those times. We have barbershops. We own a number of barbershops and a number of salons and a barber school. So I left private practice, and now I am working in a outpatient treatment facility as their clinical supervisor and part-time counselor. So most of my work is done behind the scenes. Most of it is keeping up with statute, understanding the changes, understanding 245G, 245AB, anything that we need in order to be able to give our clients services while keeping the agency running smoothly. But I ended with these pictures because this is really what I feel it's about, right? Did I ever imagine I would be the one person in my family that would come as far as I've come? most of my family members are good people. They've made their way out of stuff. I have some still struggling with active addiction, some still in and out of jail, some still, it's a mix, right? I have 9 brothers and sisters. So, but at the end of the day, so that was, the middle picture is me and my high school sweetheart. And throughout life, we went through the rigmarole, breaking up, leaving each other, having other people, different things, active addiction together. He got in trouble. He also went to treatment. He's been in recovery about a year longer than me, or 7 months longer than me. But we were married 6 months after I came home. We stayed together the entire time I was in prison. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without services. Between him and my mom, my kids were taken care of. They never entered the service. But the services that were needed while I was away for those 5 years to help them were very, very important to being able for me to keep my family together. And today, every decision I make is with them in mind. I have a 27-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 20-year-old. When I came home from prison, they were 6, 7, and 14. And all of my children have either been through college, graduated, or did trade school. They all live on their own. None of them have addiction issues or concerns. They're all happy, they're all thriving, all making good decisions. They're humans I can be very, extremely proud of. And to think that I could build this from where I came from was unimaginable 15 years ago. Unimaginable. But there was a lot of things that helped me. So when I was in college, the research paper that I talked about earlier was done, actually I'm gonna walk over here and just, because I have it open, but this is the end of this anyways. How do we get out of here? So, it was titled Reentry and Recidivism. What influence does outside support or lack thereof have on a person? I spent that entire year looking at, why was I different? What was it? Because by all accounts, I should have ended up that 75% that went back to prison. I was on parole 7 years. 7 years, that's a long time. To follow the things that are required of you, especially when you come from somewhere like me where you have no help, no resources. When I came out, it was just me and my fiance. My mom lived an hour away. I had no help with my children. I can tell you some of the things that first happened. We were trying to save up money. My husband was a barber and he wanted to open up his first business. And at that time, there was a program through Lakes and Prairie where, and I don't remember what it was called, but it was a savings program. So you would pay whatever amount and they would match it by $3. So they would keep the money and they would match it, and it could only be used for business or education. And I don't remember the name of this program to save my life, but, and I remember going to the social service building, and in Moorhead, Lakes and Prairie's right down the hall. They've got a number of agencies right within each other. And I remember signing up for that. I'd never saved money. My credit score was a 4 something when I came out, and no credit, no financial sense. But I remember them explaining it to me, and at the time I was serving. I was working at the Radisson serving. So I would get cash every day. Well, for somebody who used to be a drug dealer, that can kind of be a trigger. So what I was trying to do was find a way to not only get out of debt, but how do I put this money somewhere where, because nobody had ever taught me any of this. So when I found that program, I think I tapped out. I think the max you could save was $1,000, and then they gave you $3,000. And every day that I would come back from work, the next day I would take, whether it was $60, whether it was whatever from my tips, and go and put it in this, with this program. And that first $4,000 that they finally allotted was a big part of helping us continuing to build that business. A second resource was when I went to prison, I started my cosmetology program there. So I'm also a licensed cosmetologist, but I didn't get to finish because I went to boot camp. So I still had a number of hours left, but I came home and I couldn't get financial aid because I had been to college before and then defaulted on my loans because I got into addiction. So I can't pay those off. I'm like, what am I going to do? You know, it felt like there was going to be no hope. But then again, there was a program through another Clay County workforce program that would pay for school. They would pay for trade school, WIA. And I utilized WIA to finish my hours. And, you know, I work with WIA now in my barber school and tell that story, right? Because without it, I would have never gotten licensed. Our barber shops now employ 14 people. Our barber school can hold up to 12. We have a lot of those beginning steps. Anything that we have now kind of started from there. My parole officer, he was harsh, but he was very clear. He was very clear on what, and that's, for people like me, I need no gray area, because I will run with it. You give me gray area, and I'm going to be like, oh, but what you really meant was this. And he had a way of being very clear, but he did not play at all. And in my research, I talked about that support. A lot of people don't see that as support. But being able to actually build relationships with people, I felt supported to come to him when I struggled with things that I would have never went to people with, because I would have afraid I'm going to go back to jail. You're going to just see it this way. You're going to see it that way. You're going to think I'm making excuses. You're going to think I'm lying. But he was so transparent that if he thought I was lying, he'd just be like, okay, this is why. So explain, you know, rather than just like, well, I don't believe you. So he was a huge resource for me as I began to really build into what I wanted to do and become. We were on Medicaid, food stamps, you know, all the things. We utilized all the services when we came home. Like I said, my kids did not. I didn't have anybody to help with them, and we were both going to school and both trying to work. So, you know, child care assistance, you know, them being able to go to the Y and get a scholarship. There were so many things that I found in this research project that for me, I feel like people, there's a lack of that ability to connect, not only connect them to services, but when they get there, the people that they're working with really have to be capable of understanding and being compassionate while still knowing that, yes, they got a job to do. Because like I said, in my job is to make sure that we don't close. When we get audited, those dings are as little as possible, right? So I understand rules and regulations, and I appreciate them. But I think that really, for me, all of my success has and will continue to come from finding a balance in being self-determined, being very, you know, clear about what I want, what I don't want, what I like, what I don't like, and then having people around me who can understand that and give me the space to grow as I am in that space. So in a nutshell, that's my story. I know I tried to make it short just so I could, you know, answer any questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them out there. But yeah, that's me from then till now. So do anybody have any questions specifically about anything or any feedback? So then, okay, let me ask you guys a couple of questions. What different agencies are, and what different titles and forms do you work in the community? Anybody? Thank you. Who was that? What's your name? Karen. Karen, thank you. You see how I just asked a question and nobody said anything? Everybody sat here. Take this as you will. You can't tell me that you can work with families that are struggling, that are harsh, that are coming up against things when you're not using your voice and you're afraid to speak up, or if you don't want to. It was a simple question, and I appreciate the answer. Because if you're going to be working with children and their mental health, you're going to be coming up with kids. My son is on the spectrum. I homeschooled him from 3rd grade on. We went through we even had a CPS come in and saying we were beating him because he beats himself. I mean, would I feel comfortable speaking to someone who's going to sit there and look at me and not be able to answer my questions? No, absolutely not, and I didn't. I demanded a different supervisor, and I was a treatment director at the time, mind you, in my county that worked directly with my social service agency. So when I came across people, somebody that wanted to hear my voice, that wanted to advocate, that would speak up, that wasn't afraid, were the people I wanted on my team. Those were the people that made the most impact. Again, I was a treatment director, making 6 figures, working directly with that agency, when a report came across their file that my son was showing up to school with bruises. Do you know what that could have done to me in my recovery had I not had the tools or support? The right people really matter. So if you take away nothing from today, take away that. Take away that whatever you do in your positions, why are you doing them and how are you doing them? What's the importance of them? Because I've worked with a lot of agencies, many agencies. Actually, I was just telling Vic on the way down here, I got a call from my founder and CEO, and we were on a conference call with Clay County because they would like to develop an opioid response team. And part of my job is, what are the legalities? How do we make this happen? I mean, I have worked with so many agencies, and there's just so many holes and lack of, I feel, education, knowledge, but a desire to really connect with people where they're at. And I will always advocate that. I'm very person-centered. I believe in the person-centered approach. And that will forever be the way that I lead, because had somebody not been able to find that balance with me, I probably wouldn't be standing in front of you today.
Could you talk a little bit more about the boot camp?
Mm-hmm. Yep, so actually that was like a place that I thrived. It's boot camp like you see on TV, right? Like get up at 5 o'clock, PT, cut ricks, march for miles. It really is very physical and demanding. It's, sir, permission to speak, sir, right, left, far, like it is outlined, very structured. I struggled when I got in until I said, I met my counselor. Because to somebody like me, you're not just going to tell me what to do. And people always think that there's this societal belief that you don't love your family enough, or you don't care enough about your recovery if you continue to make choices that you know are bad. Well, we give you all this access to these things. So one of the first people that I interacted with there, I remember she was being rude, and I smart-mouthed back, and she was like, you don't really seem like you want to be here because this is what it is. And I'm like, you don't seem like you really want to be here. The interaction was not good, and I got a learning experience, which was they would set us out in the rain to cut ricks of wood, big logs, and you had to cut them down to small ones. And I remember being out in the rain so pissed off, like, who does this woman think she is? But the next person was my counselor that I interacted with. And she made me realize, she had a way of speaking to me that helped me to realize they were only there to teach structure. What I did with that structure was up to me. And how I confronted the things that happened in my environment there were going to be a testing ground for how I confronted them out here. And she had a way of just explaining things that made sense. So my selfish brain at the time, I'm like, okay, so do what you got to do. They say jump, you say how high. Doesn't really matter. This is all they want to see from you. Like the way that she made me use my own dysfunction against myself was just magical. Okay, and boot camp was that. It was very rigid expectations of physical and counseling. So we did, I think, 6 hours total of like different groups. So CBT, counseling, PT, like we did all these things. And then the rest of the time from 5 a.m. until 8 p.m. in between was spent doing manual labor. And then when you got out, you were on intense supervised release for a year. So, couldn't leave, couldn't go anywhere, all the things. It's very intense requirements. And then you step down to regular parole if you can make it off of that.
And did you have to meet certain requirements, like to be in this boot camp, you had to have certain charges, felony versus misdemeanor?
So they wouldn't accept, so the way that it was written is they wouldn't accept violent charges, but it's up for the commissioner's discretion on how violent. So I did have like a couple of assault charges, and my record in the prison also wasn't good when I first got there because I was just a mess when I first got there. So I was getting in trouble, getting in fights, I had a lot of write-ups, I was going to solitary, all those things. So it took me longer to get there than I should have, again, and all of that was on me because they do look at your total record for the ability to success. They're not going to give somebody a space that they don't feel is going to take advantage of it well. So yeah, they do look at your internal prison record, and then they look at your overall record. But like I said, the only thing they had was you couldn't have like severe violent offenses, and some of them are on case-by-case basis dependent on the commissioner. Yeah.
How did your recovery process start?
Good question. So everybody that I talk to with my clients, they always say, a lot of them haven't yet been to prison. They've been to jail, but we're working on keeping them, because we're an outpatient, right? We're working on keeping them from prison. But they've been to jail numerous times. I said, you're forced to be sober in jail. Bullshit, get to prison, you can get anything you want. And I did. The first 11 months I was not sober of my incarceration. And I can tell you the last time that I used, I got high off of smuggled in opiate pills that somebody hid in their belly button. How disgusting, right? This is addiction. This is addiction, right? This is destruction. So yeah, somebody who was capable enough to stick them inside their belly button during visitation brought them in. And I remember getting so high, and I'm laying in my room, like out of it, but yet so anxious that they're gonna know I'm high. And I'm like literally trying to act like I'm sleeping, and I'm like nodding in and out, and I was just like so mad. And I'm like, oh my God, they're gonna know, they're gonna find out, they're gonna throw me in seg, they're gonna do this, My mind is just racing. And after that, that was just like, it's not worth it. Like, okay, whatever. I'm just not even gonna go through the trouble of like getting them in here, because it's ridiculous. Like this is not feeling good to me. This is no longer feeling good to me. So that's where like my actual sobriety began. Recovery and sobriety I see as two very different things. I see sobriety as just that, right? The absence of use of any chemical or harmful chemical. Recovery is the process of healing to me. Recovery is the process of self-awareness and insight and application of tools and skills and growth. I always say, you can be sober and not be in recovery. You can be abstinent and not be in recovery. And my clients hate for me to say this to them, but that's usually because they're struggling with a behavior they don't want to change. Because I feel like recovery is very behavior heavy focused on who you are, your ethics, your character, your morals, your values, your choices in life. So yeah, for the next 3 years, because it had been 4, in the next 2, I was not living a recovery-related lifestyle in prison. I was getting in trouble, it was fighting, talking back, not really giving a shit. But then there just became a time where I started to get really annoyed with prison lifestyle, the drama. At first, it's what it drives you. There's nothing else to do in there. Prison can be good or bad, but really. And then they started offering classes, and I was like, F it, I'm gonna start taking them, even if I didn't need them, right? Like, they were classes that I had no interest in taking, but I'm like, I'm gonna take them. I took everything from parenting classes to financial resource works through employment. I took some college class. Anything they offered, I got into the mentality that I'm not gonna leave this place the same way I came in. If I'm gonna have to give the state 5 years, they're gonna give me something. I'm taking something, because I'm not leaving here empty-handed. So I started spending a lot of time in the prison library, started spending a lot of time, really learning about the things that I was learning about in some of these other classes. Started going to art class, started actually experiencing things I'd never experienced, because as a kid, like, my life was survival. That was it. My life was survival. There was no fun, there was no teaching, there was no, it was survival. So, I tell myself that's really where my recovery began, was in that last 2 years that I was in. I heavily focused on education and knowledge, heavily focused on getting my hands on anything and everything that I could. Started reading everything I could, understanding everything I could. I remember the first time I read a financial literacy book, and it talked about interest rates and buying a house, and I'm like, what the is this? Like, okay. But then I'd read it again and read it again and read it again and read it again and read it again, and nobody to explain it to me. But I'm like, this is making sense. This is making sense to me. And that's literally what I would do for those last 2 years. And then when I came home, again, my recovery was very different. So I was completely abstinent for 13 years. 3 years ago, I did take some pain medication, and I did have some wine, and I do have an occasional glass of wine here and there now. But for the first 13 years, let's talk about that. I was afraid to use drugs. I was afraid to go back to prison. The first 5, I wasn't self-motivated. I wasn't, because once I got out, all of the things came back, all of the access and people and thoughts, and I was like, oh, it's easier now. But I was motivated by other things, and those things are what would keep me through just being able to rationalize, I don't want this. So when I talk to my counselors, when I talk to my clients, they get very down about the fact when I tell them your first 5 years will be hell. But that's reality, and I wish that somebody would have been more real with me, because when I was going through treatment, it was like only 12-step based. You have to do this and this and you'll be sober. And then I'm doing all of that and I'm still effing miserable. What's the point of being sober? What's the point? Still miserable. Nothing's helping. Nothing's, and then I started digging into actual recovery related resources, going to therapy, getting into parenting classes again outside, integrating with people like running clubs and doing things in the community, starting to feel like I was part of something rather than just existing in my sobriety. I wasn't just existing anymore. I started to build this inner self-awareness, but more importantly, self-love. Every little accomplishment, I'm like, oh man, they want me to be part of this? Like, that's awesome. Like, oh, imposter syndrome would set in, and then I'd have to work through that. Why do I feel this way? Just doing a lot of deep internal work is really like my recovery process, even to this day. Even to this day, if there's something I run up against, and I'll ask myself, how are people around me behaving towards me? That tells me, that's my gauge if I'm creating a problem, or if this problem I think in my head is actually a problem, and then I'll address that thing. Like I've instituted a number of different tools and just insight for myself that will constantly help me to keep on top of my mental health, my, just overall way of life. Because I do still struggle with anxiety and depression, and those things can become problematic if I don't take care of them early. I always say, it's about taking care of them and not letting yourself get to this point where then now it becomes destructive to your recovery, because now you have no more coping skills left and you're on E. So that's essentially how my recovery is, at this stage in life.